Right, super quick one today. So basically, if you've got a road bike like this that uses a mechanical group set and you've kind of got exposed cabling up at the front here and the gear cables enter the frame via frame stops like this, then this trick should really help improve the shifting performance of both the rear derailleur here and also the front derailleur, if you want to kind of try it there. But I basically stumbled across this trick relatively recently and implemented it for the first time installing this new group set on the bike here in my last video. I had so many questions and comments about it. I thought I'd kind of break it out into a dedicated how-to in this video. Essentially, when I installed this group set, the shifting was good, but it wasn't perfect. So I set it up in the same way that I've done for years and years with loads of other frames just like this really. So you've got the kind of gear housing here, and then the housing terminates right here at this frame stop, and you can see I put a kind of end cap on the housing. Then only the gear cable itself runs through the frame over the top of a kind of guide cap underneath the bottom bracket, and then out to the front derailleur or down the chainstay, out to the back and out to the rear derailleur. And again, you'd have a small run of cable housing here with another frame stop at the back. This trick made the shifting about twice as good because basically you're trying to eliminate friction in the cable run. And I figured the majority of the friction for the gear cables was going to be concentrated as the cable runs over the top of that plastic guide cap. I figured that was kind of creating a lot of friction there. So eliminating that basically solved the problem. Here's the trick. So the frame stops here. Now this is the run for the front derailleur actually. I haven't used this trick on the front because the shifting is fine. But on the rear derailleur here, which is this one, I basically drilled this frame stop out and then just ran a continuous line of cable housing all the way through the frame out the back to the rear derailleur, and the shifting improved so much. From my understanding, mountain bikes have been set up this way for years, but for whatever reason, road bikes don't tend to use this technique, or at least not many that I've seen. I guess it's because it adds extra weight, right? Because you've got one continuous run of housing, and it's not the lightest thing in the world. So I've got some gear housing here because it's got those steel wires that run through the length of it to give it, well, to make it compression. Let's give it some rigidity, right? So it's not the lightest thing, but it makes the shifting so much nicer. So you run the housing through the frame as normal, and then rather than going underneath the bottom bracket as it's kind of normally designed to be routed on frames like this, you kind of run it the same way as you would for the rear brake hose, right? So it runs down over the top of the bottom bracket in this cavity in the frame and then out the back as normal. One other trick that I used actually when setting this up. So once I got the gear housing cut to length, I got this. So it's called, well, it's GT85. You can see it here. It's like WD-40, but it's got PTFE in it. So PTFE is a really low friction compound. So using the straw that comes with it, I basically fired some down the inner liner. You can see in the middle there, fired it all the way down just to kind of reduce as much friction as possible in that cable run to try and improve shifting. I guess not strictly necessary, but I think it helped. Right, drawbacks to this approach. So number one, drilling out those frame stops it's kind of an irreversible change, I suppose. So yeah, there is that. Number two, I suppose you could argue it's going to be a little bit noisier, right? Because when you've got the bare cables running through the frame, they tend to be under tension, right? So you have the cables running over the top of that guide cap, so they're not going to rattle as much. So with the housing just running loose through the frame, it could rattle a little bit as you're going over bumps and stuff on bumpy roads. I've not found that to be a problem at all on this particular bike, but yeah, you could argue that having the housing kind of rattling around loose in the frame is going to be a bit noisier. Another drawback, replacing any of the cable run is going to be a lot more difficult, right? So say you ride on a lot of muddier roads, you might find you replace this section of housing, I don't know, twice a year or something. So you might take it off, clean the cable in there, and then replace that bit of housing to get the shifting back to normal. With this particular approach, if you ever needed to do that, you'd need to replace the whole run of cable housing all the way through the frame. You might also need to kind of fill this hole that you've got left in the frame, right? Because previously there was kind of a frame stop right here that kind of filled that, and now you've got a hole where kind of water and grime could enter the frame. As it happened, I had this kind of rubber bung in my spare parts sort of bin, and it fits in there perfectly and seals that off. But if you've not got one of those, you might need to fill it with some hot glue or maybe some silicone sealant to prevent kind of grime entering the frame. And finally, I suppose you could argue that it might void the warranty of the frame because you're basically setting it up and using it in a way that it wasn't designed to be used from the factory. So you're drilling out the frame stops, and yeah, there is that to consider as well. But look, the shifting is so much better than it was before, specifically on this particular group set with this downshift lever here, right? So you've got 3 downshifts, 1, 2, 3. those clicks now are so much lighter and kind of crisper than they were before. So previously, you couldn't really feel the separations between those gear shifts very much. This whole lever swing here with those 3 downshifts was quite mushy. I figured because there was quite a lot of friction on that cable run, but using the cable housing all the way through reduced that friction so much, and the shift action is so much lighter, so much crisper. Now, to be fully transparent, I think one of the reasons that I struggled with shifting on this particular group set is because it's a more budget-oriented group set, right? So it's from a Chinese manufacturer called L2, and in my experience over the years fiddling around with these cheaper group sets, I feel like the return spring on the rear derailleur, like this one here, tends to be a little bit weaker, a little bit less stout than the springs you'd find on legitimate Shimano or SRAM group sets. I feel like the return springs being a little bit weaker, they don't kind of snap back and index back into position quite as readily as, yeah, legitimate Shimano or SRAM group sets. But regardless, reducing that kind of friction on the cable run really helped in this scenario, and now the shifting is spot on. One other suggestion that I got when I kind of debuted this fix in the last episode was using the white guide tubes that you get with a fresh frame. So basically, when you get a frame like this out of the box and you're building up a bike, they normally have these white tubes, right, running through the frame. So you can see just a kind of white nylon tube. They're there along the cable routes to help you route those cables the first time, right? So you kind of feed the cables through to get them in the right place. The suggestion was using the frame stops as normal, but rather than the bare cables running through the frame and through that kind of guide cap, leaving these in place, so running the cables through these within the frame. I found, well, I tried it before, I don't think it really helps, to be honest with you, because they tend to get gummed up with dirt and grime as you're using them, and in addition, they're not fixed in place, right? So as the shift cable is moving, as you're kind of shifting through the gears on the bike, these tend to kind of shift about inside the frame. So yeah, you might want to give that a go if you don't want to drill out the frame stop and make sort of permanent changes to the frame. So you might want to try it, but in my experience, it doesn't really work. 2 last bits. So you want to avoid any sharp bends in the cable run wherever possible. So when you're running the cable housing through the frame, try and avoid really sharp 90-degree bends in the housing, because it really increases friction and affects shifting. Hopefully you can see all of the bends I have and all of the curves are nice and shallow and smooth. Really helps kind of increase the performance, and it's one of the reasons why running mechanical shifting on a frame like this, where everything is kind of routed through the headset and all the cables are hidden, is quite tough, because you'll have really sharp 90-degree bends in the housing. So getting smooth shifting with mechanical group sets on a frame like this is quite tough. And finally, you might want to get yourself one of these. It's a magnetic cable routing tool, which really helps kind of feed all of the housing through the frame, and basically you can't see what you're doing. So getting one of these to help with the routing is really useful. But yeah, anyway, give it a go. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Ciao.